السلام علیکم پاکستان. میں ہوں حیدر مہدی اور یہ ایک اسپیشل ایڈیشن ہے ہمارے ویلاگ کا جو کہ میں نے انٹرویو کیا ہے پروفیسر نوام چومسکی کا، جو دنیا کے سب سے عظیم حیات انٹلیکچوئل سمجھے جاتے ہیں. اس کا میں تھوڑا سا بیک گراؤنڈ دے دوں، اور بیک گراؤنڈ یہ ہے کہ چند ہفتے پہلے جب یہ بہت زیادہ پاکستان کے اندر بربریت شروع ہو گئی تھی، بلکہ چند مہینے پہلے، اور خاص طور پہ شہباز گل کا اریسٹ اور ٹارچر اور یہ ہوا، تو ایک ہماری پروفیسر امریکہ میں ہیں ڈاکٹر رفعت حسن، لوئیویل کنٹکی میں ہے، اور پروفیسر ایمریٹس ہیں، ماشاءاللہ بہت زبردست خاتون ہیں. ان سے میرا رابطہ ہوا اور ہم نے سوچا کہ کس طرح ہم یہ پاکستان میں جو بربریت اور فیسزم اور ٹوٹلیٹیرینزم ہے اس کے لیے ہم آواز اٹھائیں، اور خاص طور پہ جو ویسٹرن مغربی جو ممالک ہیں ان کے اندر لوگوں کو بتائیں کہ یہ پاکستان میں کیا ہو رہا ہے، وہ اپنی آواز اٹھائیں. تو ڈاکٹر رفعت حسن صاحبہ ماشاءاللہ خود بھی اپنے ان کی حیثیت بھی بہت بلند ہے، بڑی زبردست انٹلیکچوئل ہیں. انہوں نے پروفیسر نوام چومسکی کو ایک ای میل ڈال دی اور انہوں نے کہا پروفیسر نوام چومسکی یہ ہو رہا ہے پاکستان میں، اور آپ نے اگست میں ایک خط لکھا تھا 59 انٹلیکچوئلس کو کہ جس میں سگنیچرز تھے، دستخط تھے چیف جسٹس عطا محمد بندیال کو، اور کہا تھا کہ یہ پاکستان میں جو بربریت ہو رہی ہے، شہباز گل کو اریسٹ کیا گیا ہے، میڈیا کے خلاف یہ جو بند ہو رہے ہیں چینلز، ARY کا ذکر ہوا، اور یہ جو فزیکل ٹارچر ہو رہا ہے، اور جرنلسٹ جو چھوڑ کے پاکستان بھاگ رہے ہیں، ارشد شریف کا، صابر شاکر کا، اور اس طرح کا یہ بالکل ننگی فیسزم ہے، ٹوٹلیٹیرینزم ہے، بربریت ہے، اور ہم اس کے بہت خلاف آواز اٹھانا چاہتے ہیں. اور اس قسم کا انہوں نے ان کو یاد دلایا اور ان کو یہ ای میل کر دی. ہمیں ویسے امید نہیں تھی کہ وہ نوام چومسکی صاحب جواب دیں گے، لیکن انہوں نے جواب دیا اور انہوں نے کہا کہ بھائی دیکھو، میں اس وقت مجھے اتنا پتہ بھی نہیں ہے پاکستان کا، اور ہاں اس میں رفعت حسن صاحبہ نے کہا کہ اور یہ حیدر مہدی ہیں میرے ساتھی ہیں اور یہ آپ کو انٹرویو کرنا چاہتے ہیں، تو آپ پلیز کائنڈلی وقت نکالیے گا. تو انہوں نے خیر جواب دیا کہ بھائی بہت شکریہ، مجھے دیکھیں پاکستان کے متعلق اتنا تو معلوم نہیں ہے، اور میں ابھی 93 سال کا ہوں، اور میں اس پر کیا بات کر سکتا ہوں. خیر ہم لگے رہے، ہم نے کہا نہیں پروفیسر چومسکی صاحب، اچھا آپ صرف یہ ہمیں بتائیے گا، اور ایک سوال لکھ کے بھیج دیا کہ یہ ہمیں آپ 5 منٹ کا جو ہے نا زوم پر آپ اپنا انٹرویو دے دیں. پھر انہوں نے کہا کہ دیکھو بڑی مشکل ہے، یہ نہیں ہے، میں نہیں کر سکتا. خیر پھر ہم لگے رہے، پھر ہم نے ان کو جواب دیا کہ یہ میں آپ کو بتا رہا ہوں کہ دیکھیے یہ کیسے ہوتا ہے، یہ ایک بالکل ایک جو کہتے ہیں نہ ہونے والی بات ہوئی، اس میں یہ اللہ کا معجزہ ہے. تو اور میری کہاں کوئی حیثیت پروفیسر رفعت حسن کی تو پھر بھی بڑی حیثیت ہے، ماشاءاللہ انہوں نے 30-40 سال یہ کام کیا ہے، 5-6 کتابیں لکھی ہیں، ہزاروں انہوں نے آرٹیکل لکھے، میں کہاں پیدی اور پیدی کا شور ہوا. تو اینی وے انہوں نے پھر آخر میں کہا بھائی دیکھو، میں نے کہا اچھا بھائی، ہم نے کہا کہ اچھا بھائی یہ آپ صرف جو ہے نا اپنا یہ ایک چھوٹا سا ہم آپ کو اقتصاب بھیج رہے سوال، اس کا جواب دے دے صرف ای میل میں. انہوں نے محنت کر کے اور ایک جواب دے دیا کہ بھائی میں کر سکتا ہوں، اور میں مجھے بس آئی وش آئی کوڈ ڈو، میری خواہش ہے کہ میں کچھ اور بھی کر سکتا آپ لوگوں کے لیے جو پاکستان میں ہے. تو پھر ہم نے پھر دیکھی کہ چھوٹی سی کھڑکی پھر کھل گئی. پھر ان کو کہہ دیا کہ اچھا پروفیسر صاحب اگر آپ تھوڑا سا بس یہ سوال انٹرویو دے دیں. آخر کار وہ مان گئے پچھلے ہفتے، اور انہوں نے پھر ہمیں 26 ستمبر کو کہا کہ بھئی تھوڑا سا چھوٹا سا انٹرویو دینا. بس وہ پھر انٹرویو لینے کے والے کے ہاتھ میں ہوتا ہے. تو انہوں نے کوئی تقریباً 35-40 منٹ کا انٹرویو دیا، اور وہ انٹرویو انشاءاللہ اب آپ کو ہم سنواتے ہیں. وہ انٹرویو کا جو شروع ہے اس کا انٹروڈکشن میں نے انگریزی میں کیا ہے بیکاز اور اس کی ہم سب ٹائٹلنگ بھی کریں گے. ان کا انٹرویو بھی انگریزی میں ہے اور اس کی بھی ہم سب ٹائٹلنگ ضرور کریں گے. تو امید ہے آپ کو یہ انٹرویو پسند آئے گا. دیکھیے گا پروفیسر نوام چومسکی کے ساتھ میرا انٹرویو. Earlier today I interviewed Professor Noam Chomsky, and I'm just going to give you a brief background on the professor. He's considered is considered amongst the world's greatest intellectuals and most brilliant minds living today. He has been a defining Western intellectual figure, central to the field of linguistics and definitive in cognitive sciences, computer science, philosophy, psychology, and of course, international relations and politics. He's authored more than 150 books. He's the world's most widely read author and currently a laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona and an institute professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I mean, Professor Chomsky doesn't need an introduction to most of the people, but the people in Pakistan may not know as much about him, so hence this introduction. Similar to his intellectual accomplishments have been Professor Chomsky's most influential social and political opinion making in the world. He became publicly involved in the politics in 1964 when he felt compelled to lend his voice against the US role in what he called the US invasion of Vietnam. He was one of the first great intellectuals who raised their voice against it, and at no small risk to his career and even his personal safety. In his view, the Vietnam War was only one in a series of cases in which the US used its military power to gain or consolidate economic control over increasingly larger areas of the developing world. In February 1967, Professor Chomsky rose to national attention for his first political essay entitled The Responsibility of Intellectuals, which was published as a special supplement by the New York Review of Books. In this anti-war essay, he presented case after case in which intellectuals in positions of power, including prominent journalists, failed to tell the truth or deliberately lied to the public in order to conceal the aims and consequences of the US involvement in the Vietnam War. As a responsible member of the intellectual class, Professor Chomsky believes that it is the obligation to provide ordinary citizens with the information they need to draw their own conclusions and opinions and make their own decisions about vital political and economic issues. As he wrote in later essays, Powers and Prospects in 1996, he says the responsibility of the writer or the critic as a moral agent is to try to bring the truth and matters of human significance to an audience that can do something about them. In a humble way, that's what we are doing, and that's what my interview with Professor Chomsky is about. Today, at the age of 93, he is as alert and as sharp, as you will see in the interview, as one can be, and he remains a leading critic of US foreign policy, of the contemporary state capitalism that pervades the world, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has time and time again called out the hypocrisy of the Israeli invasion and the occupation of Palestine and the two-state narrative, which is so glibly voiced by the West. And his ideas continue to enrich and empower anti-capitalist and anti-imperial movement. He has a hugely vigilant eye on global affairs, as you will see in the interview, and his insight into Pakistan and the efforts by former Prime Minister Imran Khan to fight this totalitarianism and fascism in Pakistan, in this military-backed, US-supported regime, which is currently in Pakistan. And he's obviously very concerned about the escalation of violence towards political opponents and media, as we discussed what is happening in Pakistan, and since the overthrow of Prime Minister Imran's government in April. And then I opened this interview giving him some context about the letter he wrote to Chief Justice Ata Muhammad Bandial. And please do watch this interview. It is the first time that Professor Chomsky, the world's leading intellectual, the leading brilliant mind at 93, talks about Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan, and his battle against totalitarianism, fascism, a free, independent, democratic Pakistan where there is rule of law and everyone lives peacefully, safety, with their fundamental rights intact. Thank you very much. And over to the interview now. I really want to thank you very much for accepting this kind invitation to seek your insights on what you call U.S. exceptionalism and I call global hegemony and its impact on countries like Pakistan. This, Professor Chomsky, just for your information, is the first inaugural conversation by the Canada-Pakistan Democracy Forum, which has been exclusively established to promote democracy in Pakistan, which is currently under a totalitarian, military-backed, fascist and very corrupt regime. For context, Professor Chomsky, I just want to remind you that you wrote a letter along with 59 other intellectuals in August 21 to the Chief Justice of Pakistan, expressing great concerns over the torture of former Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the intimidation against the media, the closure of TV channels, the fascism which has led to many journalists fleeing Pakistan. Myself, I've been charged under sedition clauses for inciting insurrection and rebellion. My two sons, who have nothing to do with politics, who live in Canada, have been charged with false cases. So when they travel, they're arrested and they force me to come back. So lots is happening, Professor Chomsky. In a nutshell, Pakistan is today in the complete grip of a very totalitarian, fascist, corrupt forces, backed by its military chief, General Bajwa, and opposed very strongly by the vast majority of Pakistanis under the leadership of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who's just calling for fair and free elections. So the first question I sent you earlier, and I just want to see that, why does the USA support such authoritarian, dictatorial, and military-ruled backed non-representative regimes who trample fundamental rights, free speech, democratic values, imprison, torture, and kill political foes, especially in third world countries like Pakistan, when they themselves profess to be the greatest champions of democracy and free speech and fundamental rights in the world? Professor Chomsky.
It's very easy to profess all sorts of marvelous commitments and goals. So Joseph Stalin, for example, professed to be a dedicated Democrat committed to developing people's democracies, which would support and defend human rights and freedom everywhere. That's easy. Hitler made similar professions. We disregard the professions of leaders of powerful states. That's rhetoric. We look at practice. With regard to the practice, you know better than I, with regard to Pakistan, the United States has consistently supported harsh and brutal military dictatorships in Pakistan and opposed efforts at moderate social reform and independence. And it's not just Pakistan, almost everywhere. And there are reasons for it. So, for example, there have been studies by some of the leading scholars in the United States, mainstream scholars, showing that comparing U.S. foreign aid and torture, Lars Schultz, one of the leading specialists on human rights in Latin America, did an extensive study showing that U.S. foreign aid in Latin America is very closely correlated with the most egregious forms of torture. Now, it's not because the U.S. likes torture, it's because they don't care. There's a second study which explains this by my late colleague, Edward Herman, economist, who did a study which demonstrated the obvious. U.S. foreign aid is closely correlated with improvements in the investment climate, the climate for foreign investment. as that improves, U.S. aid extends. Well, it happens that the improvement of the investment climate is closely correlated with torture. Regimes come in that are committed to improving the climate for foreign investment. They have to suppress domestic popular organizations, impose harsh regimes, use torture to ensure that they can maintain their objectives. So there's a secondary correlation between U.S. foreign aid and torture. Again, it's not that the U.S. loves torture. It's just that happens to be the way in which investment climate is improved. Well, same with supporting dictatorships. The basic principle is try to improve the climate for U.S. investors, create what's called a world that's open for U.S. economic penetration and political control to follow U.S. general objectives. And it happens that didn't invent this. I mean, that's the way imperial policy works. The United States since 1945 happens to be by far the dominant hegemonic power in the world. In fact, the greatest in history. As the world dominant power in 1945, it immediately turned to these policies. So, for example, February 1945, before the war was even over, the United States called a hemispheric conference, brought all the countries of the Western Hemisphere together in Mexico for a conference in which they pretty much were compelled to accept what was called an economic charter for America. And the economic charter, if you look back at the documents which are now available, was the commitment was to put an end to all economic nationalism. Economic nationalism meant, spelled out, a country committed to using its resources for its own people. You have to end that. The first priority of a country is to use its resources, leave its resources open to exploitation by U.S. capital, not for their own purposes.
Wow.
So no new nationalism. It was all very frank and straight. I'm virtually quoting, nothing secret. Well, that's Latin America, uniquely under U.S. control, extends to other countries to the extent possible. Sometimes it's not possible. So, for example, take Cuba. In 1959, the first time was liberated. It had been a virtual colony of the United States, but it was liberated by the Castro Revolution in January 1959. Within a few months, Cuba was being bombed from Florida, from U.S. territory. By March 1960, it's a year after liberation, the Eisenhower administration secretly, now it's public, formally determined to overthrow the government. John F. Kennedy came in, immediately invaded. When the invasion was defeated, institutes authorized a major terrorist war to overthrow the government, along with very harsh sanctions. It's been continued since 60 years of brutal, harsh sanctions, sabotage, terrorism. And the reasons are formally stated. U.S. is a quite unusually free society, so we have unusual access to internal documents. A lot of them are declassified. Go back to the State Department documents in the 1960s, Kennedy and Johnson, declassified, say very frankly, I quote, the problem of Castro is Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which declared the U.S. intention to dominate the hemisphere. Cuba is defying them, successfully defying them, therefore it has to be destroyed. Same everywhere.
Professor Chomsky, Cuba and all these others that you talk about, especially in Latin America, with reference to Pakistan, Professor Chomsky, we're a nuclear-armed state. And the anti-American sentiment in Pakistan is massive, especially because Imran Khan is perhaps one of the most popular leaders ever in the history of our country. Close to 90% of people support his social reform, his anti-militarism, his crusade against corruption, building of strong democratic institutions. If America continues to impose this kind of behavior that it has done in Cuba and Iran and other countries, Pakistan can descend into complete chaos and anarchy. And for a nuclear-armed country to do that is hugely detrimental to a very selfish U.S. security interest. So I fail to understand, why does it do so when it is actually, to use a cliche, digging its own grave by pushing Pakistan into the brink of anarchy and chaos?
It's true that Pakistan is nuclear armed, but that's because the U.S. favored its nuclear armament. The Reagan administration pretended, I stress pretended, that it didn't know that Zia-ul-Haq was carrying out nuclear armament. Of course it knew. But it pretended it didn't because it didn't care. Pakistan was supporting U.S. goals, was supporting U.S. policy, anti-Russian policy in Afghanistan. The U.S. wanted to wean Pakistan away from Chinese influence. So if Pakistan wanted to develop nuclear weapons, we pretend we don't see it. And then, of course, we tacitly authorize it after we don't like it. So that's why Pakistan is a nuclear-armed country. Right now, you can ask whether U.S. policy is well-designed for U.S. purposes. But the purposes are not obscure, the same as they've always been. Same when they supported the Zia dictatorship, other dictatorships. Maybe it's, imperial powers make errors, like invading Afghanistan was an error. Okay, so you pull out of it. But the policies remain pretty solid. And Imran Khan, as you say, was pursuing policies that aimed at the interests of Pakistan. Let's go back to the Economic Charter of America. It's violating the fundamental principles. The primary beneficiaries of a country's resources are not the people of the country. They are, the primary beneficiaries are the international investment community, which is overwhelmingly dominated by the United States, U.S. capital. So the U.S. plausibly believes that Khan is not the right person to run Pakistan. The dictators will be more forthcoming. Maybe that's an error. Countries make errors. But it's not an irrational policy. It's normal, rational imperialism, which has, over time, played out very well. It's to run the world since 1945 is not a small achievement.
Professor Chomsky, is there any hope for countries like Pakistan or for democratic leaders like Imran to be able to come back or first combat this American imperialism and American exceptionalism, as you say, and survive, or are we doomed to suffer the consequences of American imperialism?
First of all, remember, we're talking about governments, not people. People of the United States, most of them don't even know where Pakistan is. They may think it's in Africa somewhere. Population knows nothing about what's going on. It's a very insular country, and all the information and educational system is designed to keep people from knowing and understanding what's happening in the world. These are elite phenomena, narrow sectors of intellectual elites, policy elites, the business world, which of course is sophisticated and informed and pretty much runs the government. Popular movements can make a difference. They have in many cases. Popular movements of the 1960s changed the country significantly. I mean, take the war in Vietnam. It took years, many years, to develop an anti-war movement. People didn't know where Vietnam was, didn't know what was happening, but it finally developed to a major popular movement. Same in other cases. And that's the hope. The hope really is people-to-people contact. Pakistan, Americans, others can develop unified international solidarity to overthrow this whole system of hegemony and domination. It's not an easy task, but it's within reach, and some progress has been made. But the beginning with regard to Pakistan would be for a movement in the United States supported by Pakistanis. Pakistani emigres can play a great role in this to try to develop popular understanding. Canada, the United States, develop a mass movement in which people will know what's happening. That's the first step. And then quickly will come to oppose it as soon as they know what's happening.
Two-part question, Professor Chomsky. While the immigrant community, people like myself and many others in the US and Canada and the Western world, so to speak, will continue to raise the voice against these kind of support for fascist totalitarian regimes, do you think that is enough to overcome the power structures within the US system, the defense lobby, the other lobbies, which thrive on these forever wars, as you call them, and there is no other interest other than pure economic profit and gain? How do we overcome that? How do we influence American policy?
Dedicated work that's required to develop popular movements. In the case of Pakistan, in the United States, people don't know a thing. They don't know where Pakistan is, and probably some Arabs. You find it hard to believe the ignorance. I could give you some examples which would shock you. So, for example, just take one case. Under the Shah of Iran, when they were strong US allies then, brutal, murderous tyrant, US was strongly supporting him. The university where I was, MIT, was being pressured by the government, Henry Kissinger and others, to help the Shah develop nuclear weapons programs. That was
Really?
the 1970s. I remember we worked at MIT hard to try to organize the student body to protest against the support for nuclear programs in Iran. We managed hard work. We got a lot of students opposed. They learned about it, didn't like it, and so on. Finally got to the point where there was a big faculty meeting in which usually people don't go to faculty meetings, they're too boring. But this was a big one, so everyone came to discuss the MIT support for nuclear programs in Iran. They didn't mention nuclear weapons. That was still secret, but it was happening. But the meeting was very interesting. There was a referendum among students. There were about 80% opposed. There was a vote at the faculty meeting, which was 80% in favor. Now, if you think about it, the faculty of today are the students of yesterday, but their institutional role had changed, and that changed attitudes. Well, anyway, to give you an answer, I was one of the few opponents in the faculty meeting. There were a handful of us. As I was walking out, the dean of engineering, who described himself as an Iranian specialist, read Iranian poetry, knew all about Iran and so on, he was walking out together with me, and he turned to me and he said, "I don't understand your position. I thought you were pro-Arab." He thought Iran was an Arab country. That's the level of understanding. Well, Pakistan, they know even less. So there's a lot of work to do.
So, Professor Chomsky, with this current battle by former Prime Minister Imran Khan in trying to fight for an independent Pakistan, and like you said, not serve the economic interests of the US investment interests. And there is this regime which is backed by the US and supported by the Army Chief. Where is hope for us right now? I know there's this long battle we need to do with the American system and the American public opinion. But what would you, with your tremendous insight on what the American mind thinks and how they do stop the establishment, what would you advise Imran to do to be able to appear acceptable to the Americans and tell them you're creating the potential of a nuclear conflagration in the world if you continue to support this fascist regime in Pakistan, because the country is going to erupt into chaos? What does he need to do?
The only answer is to try to educate. That includes intellectuals, like what I was talking about. It's a leading intellectual. They don't know. The public has no idea. They probably think Pakistanis are Arabs of some kind. So there's a huge educational program which can be carried out on the ground in journals when they're willing, meetings, popular organizations, try to expand understanding, and following understanding often comes commitment. There's no easy path, but it's not impossible. It's been done many times. The anti-Vietnam movement was a case, anti-nuclear movement, hard work, but can be done. And there's no alternative, nothing else.
Professor Chomsky, final question. I know you wanted to make it brief. Professor Chomsky, why does the American establishment do this other than economic interest? Is there anything else? When you say imperialism, what is driving this mad rush towards global hegemony other than economic interest? Is there anything else?
Economic interests mixed with power interests. Like, for example, with regard to, take Cuba again. The U.S. has no economic interest in crushing Cuba. In fact, it's kind of interesting that U.S. businesses want to enter the Cuban market, big ones. Pharmaceutical industry would love to get contact with Cuba's advanced pharmaceutical industry. Energy industry would love to, big industry wants to exploit the Cuban resources. They have oil resources. Agribusiness would love to get in. But the government understands that you cannot permit independence. That's too dangerous. Once you have independence, could spread. It's kind of like the mafia. Suppose the mafia don doesn't get paid by some small grocer somewhere. There's no economic in it. He doesn't care, won't even notice it. But he's still going to send his goons to crush him. You can't let that spread. You start letting the ideas of independence and disobeying orders spread.
So it's just pure, unadulterated lust for domination and power. And like the mafia don, you can't even look me in the eye. I'm going to cut off your horse's head and put it in your bed.
Basically, mafia is not a bad analogy to international affairs. Of course, they are the overwhelming economic interests. After all, it's the business world that largely controls the government. It's interesting that sometimes they're in conflict, like Cuba, but the overarching necessity to prevent independence even controls business interests. It's not a simple matter. There's history, human affairs are complicated matters.
Is there hope within the American character, within the American public? Is there hope that they themselves will be able to overturn this hegemonistic, imperialistic U.S. exceptionalism and turn, the U.S. into more a benevolent godfather rather than a mafia godfather?
There's a reason for the huge efforts at indoctrination and propaganda. It's fear of the public. Ordinary people have decent instincts. They don't like to torture, they don't like to oppress, and so on. So you have to control them. That's why I have a huge propaganda system. If it wasn't for that, you wouldn't need it.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much. I'm deeply, deeply indebted to you. We hope your words reach the American establishment, reach the American people. Your voice is the greatest intellectual voice in the world today. I hope it has an impact. Your prayers and well-being for Prime Minister Imran and the people of Pakistan we're really grateful. We hope we see a free democratic Pakistan soon. Thank you very much for your time, Professor.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, sir.